Okay, so the recording has started. So now officially welcome everybody to the a meeting of the traditional Buddhist chanting class. We are starting tonight. We're going to be discussing the Heart Sutra, and so for our next four meetings, we will discuss the Heart Sutra. We meet on the first and third Tuesday of every month. This is the first Tuesday of July, 2023. And so to start the class off, we're going to chant the Heart Sutra together. And so, which which means I'm going to mute everybody and play a recording because that's the only way we can really chant it together on Zoom. Okay, so, before I do anything else, I got to make sure I've got my computer plugged in so it doesn't run out of power and crash the meeting, which will happen. Okay, good. So, uh, so we're going to talk about the Heart Sutra. Now, all of you are at least somewhat familiar with the Heart Sutra. It's not completely new. So, does anybody have like any questions or something that you want to bring up, or does anybody here understand the Heart Sutra and want to explain it to the rest of us, or any takers on just throwing something out there? Just and yeah, go ahead, Camille.
I was curious when I was, and I don't know if you're getting to this, we can get to it later as well. When I was translating it from Mandarin, like how they translate, like if you look at the actual characters
Hmm.
for how they're talking about nirvana,
Yes.
it comes up like it's I don't know, it doesn't translate. It just sort of
It doesn't make
translated as like
sense.
a bowl of like blackness. Is
Yeah.
kind of how it translated to me. But that
Yeah.
was also like the literal translation. So I was just
Yeah.
curious.
So that's another example of transliteration where they've used some characters for their sound, not for their meaning. And actually, the guy who wrote the Heart Sutra, Xuanzang, he established a set of rules or guidelines for when to transliterate and when to translate. Um, and so, like in English, we say Nirvana, which although it's the name of a band, and it's kind of entered into the English language, we all know that it's not an English word. It's a Sanskrit word. We say it's a Sanskrit word, but we're pronouncing it, using the sounds of our language to approximate the sounds of Sanskrit. So it's transliterated. When we write it out, Nirvana, we're using our own alphabet to write. So that's what Xuanzang was doing for Nirvana. He does it for other terms. He does it for the mantra at the end of the Heart Sutra, and so I can't remember what his five rules were, but American translators do not follow Xuanzang's five rules for when to transliterate and when to translate. In fact, a lot of American translators are just nuts for translating everything, and so they would take the Heart Sutra and they would kind of mangle, like something like Nirvana, and try to translate it character for character and turn it into nonsense. So anyway, but yeah, it's a good question. And there's actually a lot of instances in the Heart Sutra where the way it's written out in Chinese characters is actually an attempt by Chinese people to write out the Sanskrit using their alphabet, using the characters, the transliteration. And anything, and we might talk more about that. Any other questions or ideas? Or yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Um, I am looking forward to hearing what you will be saying and where this discussion goes, because I think when I read Red Pine's Heart
Okay.
Sutra,
Yep.
I think I came away from that, and maybe I took it the wrong way. It was a hard book to get through, but I really felt that aspects of the Heart Sutra were written to also clarify teachings to, I guess, what would be Hinayana
Okay. Yeah.
back in the day.
Actually, Sarvastivadin. So that's one. So one of the theories about the Heart Sutra is that it's actually kind of a critique of, or you're saying clarify. That's a nice way of putting it, but it's a, and all these things where we say know this, know that, know these, know those. It's all categories of philosophical categories of Buddhism that were very important to some Buddhists, and actually, they're actually important to all Buddhists. I mean, it isn't, so to some extent it was directed at Sarvastivadins, but it was only because, well, if I'm getting this right, and I don't know, I'm way out of my depth here. I think I think it's Sarvastivadins, but there was some people in the minds of those who composed the Heart Sutra, and one of the things that I'm going to talk about is like who is that? Who composed Heart Sutra? It's a sutra, so supposedly it's the words of the Buddha. So nobody composed it; the Buddha taught it, right? But it it is a it is a saying that even categories that are important for Buddhism, even ideas that are very important to Buddhists, are ultimately empty.
Right.
Which, of course, all good Buddhists should know already. It's a reminder of that, right? Anyway, I kind of preempted what you were saying because I thought I knew where you were going, Joe. So
no, that's it exactly.
Yeah.
But more like it was a teaching lesson against believing too deeply in various aspects.
Right.
So
Yeah. So I think it would be it's too narrow to say that it's just a critique of one particular school of Buddhism, and because all the things that are listed in the Heart Sutra that are being negated with all these moo 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 moo, when we chant it, and this one of the beautiful things about chanting it in the Sino-Korean is that we get to say moo a lot. It's a good moo practice, chanting the Heart Sutra. But all of those are things that aren't particular to any particular school of Buddhism. They are concepts that are used in teaching and studying and explaining Buddhism, but ultimately they're also empty. Okay.
thank you.
Sure. Okay. So I will, speaking of the Heart Sutra, and speaking of, oh yeah, here we are. Is this it? Yeah, this is it. Okay. I'm going to share my screen now. Go into slideshow mode from the beginning. Go into presentation mode. And there we go. All right. So what the heck is the Heart Sutra? What kind of a sutra is it? What does sutra actually mean? Is the Heart Sutra a sutra? These are all actually kind of legitimate questions. For one thing, anybody who knows anything about Buddhist sutras, whether they're Mahayana or Hinayana or any other, they're always supposed to start with "Thus have I heard," which in Pali is Evam Me Sutam, something like that. In Sanskrit, Evam Maya Srutam. The Chinese is great because this character. Whoops, I did it. I try not to do that, but I always do it. All right. This character here means like or as. It's a comparative word. It means like. This character means this. This character means I. And this character means here. So the Chinese is literally like this I heard. And that's what Ananda says at the beginning of every sutra. Oh, except for the Heart Sutra. Ananda is nowhere to be seen in the Heart Sutra. And it doesn't say, "Thus have I heard." So it turns out that there are other sutras, and I'm going to put sutras in quotes here, that do not begin with "Thus have I heard" and are not the direct words of Shakyamuni Buddha as recounted by Ananda. So one very famous case that I'm going to talk quite a bit about, is the Platform Sutra. Now, everybody here know the Platform Sutra? Not necessarily by heart, but you recognize what the Platform Sutra is? Okay, so the Platform Sutra is, well, I'm going to talk about that quite a bit, but it's Hui Neng, who was the sixth ancestor of Chinese Zen, and like along with Bodhidharma is really the co-founder of Zen as we know it. He came 6 generations later. Bodhidharma kind of got the ball rolling, and Hui Neng is the one who has really kind of put the stamp on Zen as we know it. And he did so in a teaching that comes down to us as the Platform Sutra. It's not the words of the Buddha, it's the words of Hui Neng. Okay, anyway. So also, the next chant that we're going to be doing in this class on chanting is the Kanzeon Sutra, which again doesn't start with "Thus have I heard," and it's not. No one claims that it is the actual words that were spoken by the Buddha. Nevertheless, it's called a sutra. In the Korean tradition, there is the 1,000 Hands and Eyes Sutra, which is a very important chant in the Korean Buddhism. It's basically the container that holds the Great Dharani. And so when you do the Great Dharani, one way of doing the 1,000 Hands and Eyes Sutra is that when you get to the part of the 1,000 Hands and Eyes Sutra, which is kind of in the middle of the chant where the Great Dharani is, then you repeat the Great Dharani over and over again. And when you do that within the context of this larger chant, it's supposed to basically supercharge the Great Dharani, make it even more powerful and effective. Yeah, we're going to talk about the Great Dharani, after the Kanzeon Sutra as well. And we'll talk more about ways of doing the Great Dharani, both inside and not inside the Thousand Hands and Eye Sutra. Dogen wrote a little thing that he called the Mountains and Waters Sutra. Here's the sutra I wrote, said Dogen. Okay, now, so part of the problem with identifying the Heart Sutra as whether or not it's a sutra, what kind of a sutra it is that for the most part, not just Western Buddhists, but Buddhists in general have this set idea of, oh, this is what Buddhists mean by sutra. It's the teachings that were given by the Buddha, that Ananda was present and committed to memory, and that Ananda was able to recount even after the Buddha was dead. And when he recounted them, and eventually this was written down, and when they were written down, it included Ananda's introductory statement, "Thus have I heard," or "Like this I heard." And so, but then there's these other things that don't fit that. The Heart Sutra, the Platform Sutra, the Kanzeon Sutra, the Thousand Hands and Eye Sutra, Dogen's Mountains and Water Sutra. Now, one of these things is especially notable because people have paid attention to it. Okay, so people have actually noticed this about the Heart Sutra going back to great Chinese scholar named Fa Zhang, who just said, "Oh, this is because this is a Heart Sutra. It doesn't have the 'Thus have I heard' at the beginning." Also, another thing that's missing in the Heart Sutra is at the end of any sutra, there's supposed to be some instructions from the Buddha about how this sutra is supposed to be propagated and disseminated. That's also missing from the Heart Sutra. But here's what somebody said. Red Pine. Oh, we were just talking about Red Pine. Okay, so Red Pine he has a translation of the Platform Sutra, and this is what he has to say. A sutra, and this is actually as a glossary in the back of the book, okay? A sutra normally contains the sermons of a Buddha or Buddha's disciples. Although no one knows who bestowed such a distinction on this text, it is the only Chinese Buddhist text that has been so honored. So that is to say, it's the only Chinese Buddhist text that isn't a sutra that has been honored with being called a sutra. This is also an indication of the extent to which Huineng's followers went to elevate their master's teachings above the teachings of all other Chinese Buddhists. Now, Red Pine, if he thought about it, Red Pine is perfectly well aware of these other examples, except with the possible exception of the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra, which is mostly originally the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra comes from China. It's not clear whether or not it was called a sutra before it came to Korea or not, but anyway, Red Pine is perfectly aware of the Kanzeon Sutra and Dogen's Mountains and Waters Sutra. So it's not clear why he says this is the only Chinese Buddhist text ever so honored. But that's from his commentary on the Platform Sutra. Now, here's some more comments on this issue from other translators of the Platform Sutra. This is from Philip Yampolsky. Prior to the Platform Sutra, we have no instance in which a work which was merely the record of the career and sermons of a certain master is given the name sutra. Strictly speaking, of course, it is not one, which is an interesting sentence, strictly speaking. So everybody calls it the Platform Sutra. When Philip Yampolsky did his translation of it, the cover of the book says Platform Sutra on it. Strictly speaking, of course, it is not one. Thus, Chi Sung, I'm not sure who Chi Sung is, took pains to justify his classification as such. Huineng was a Bodhisattva monk, and his preaching of the Platform Sutra is basically no different from the Buddha's preaching the sutras. Okay. This is all about the Platform Sutra, but I'm just talking about, what's a sutra and how does something get to be called a sutra, and because the question of whether or not the Heart Sutra really is a sutra is actually a somewhat interesting question. So here's another. This is from a book by a bunch of different teachers, including Stanley Lombardo in the Quantum School of Zen, but a number of other people who did a collection of translations of important books, important works related to Zen. Part of this book is the biographical portion of the Platform Sutra. And so they have this to say: one of the most important masters in the history of Zen was Huineng, an uneducated layman who did not become a monk until many years after he was given transmission to become the sixth patriarch. Huineng's teachings have been so admired that they have been entitled the Platform Sutra. Although strictly speaking, it's not a sutra. That is to say, although strictly speaking, a sutra is supposed to represent the words of the historical Buddha. All right, and here's one more. And this is from John McRae's translation of the Platform Sutra. The text that is translated here, of course, is so he goes on and on. McRae is kind of a wordy, it's very interesting, but he's a bit of a wordy fellow, in my opinion. He's gone on and on in his introduction about the development, because there's actually many different versions of the Platform Sutra. And he says the text that is translated here, of course, is the mature version of the text, a composite of Yuan Dynasty editions. Is substantially longer than the Dongwang version. At one point, its editor admits freely to adding dialogues and clarifications not in any of the texts he worked from. In addition to these accretions, this version of the Platform Sutra is notable for its elaborate set of opening and closing flourishes, and encomium by famous Kisong. I think that was the person that Red Pine was quoting from, and epitaphs by the Tang literati official Liu Zhangwang and Liu Yuxi being the most significant. Is interesting to note the extent to which these figures accept the image of Huineng presented in the text as a historical certainty, as well as the efforts they take to justify the non-transmission of the robe and bowl to Huineng's successors, which is an interesting part of the Platform Sutra. Even more ironic, perhaps, are the efforts by Kisong and the editor Zhang Bao to qualify the Platform Sutra as equivalent to scripture spoken by the Buddha, but at the same time to suggest that it is somehow other than the words to which the first patriarch Bodhidharma said we must not cling. So this is even this is actually sometimes people overuse or misuse ironic. This is genuinely ironic, because to take a text by a Zen teacher that is very much in line with the very traditional kind of hardcore Zen approach, that this is a special teaching outside the sutras, and then to label it as a sutra in order to enhance its validity is a bit ironic. Yes, I would say. But yeah, but is the Heart Sutra a sutra? Well, there's a version of the Heart Sutra that does have "Thus did I hear" at one time at the beginning of it. The Tibetan version, which actually is based upon a Sanskrit version, it's slightly longer than the one that we chant, and this is how it starts. "Thus did I hear one time." The Bhagavan was dwelling on Mass of Vultures Mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice. Now it starts to sound like the Heart Sutra that we know. At that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara: "How should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom?" And so, this is a translation from the Tibetan, but this Tibetan version here is a translation from Sanskrit. And so there is this question that people have: which came first? In East Asian Buddhism, in China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, people don't pay much attention to the Sanskrit versions of the Heart Sutra. They chant Xuanzang's Chinese version of the Heart Sutra. Everyone does, and even in some countries, there have. So even in China, when they chant it, it's very old-fashioned Chinese. It's not modern, and it's classical literary Chinese, which is very condensed and like they used to say in the old Charlie Chan movies, I guess, inscrutable. It's very difficult to although parts of it are quite clear and direct, but it's very condensed. But that's what everyone chants. The Sanskrit version is a little bit more elaborate, as we just saw from the English translation of the Tibetan translation of the Sanskrit version. But Jen, not actually, her name is pronounced Nattier. I would, being from the Midwest, I would pronounce it Nattier, Nattier. But John Nattier, she's a really amazing scholar. Who is an expert in virtually every language that is important to classical Buddhist studies, including like languages like Mongolian. So when she was teaching it, this is her story about how she came upon her theory about the origin of the Heart Sutra, which, I'll just read what she said. It was around 1989, and I was teaching about the Prajnaparamita Sutras for the first time to students at the University of Hawaii. The paper that I wrote, and so to some people, this is a fairly famous and controversial paper. The paper that I wrote on the Heart Sutra came about completely by accident. It was triggered by what happened when I was teaching my students about the Large Sutra, which is the large Prajnaparamita Sutra. And I think it's 100,000 lines long. And the Heart Sutra, the Large Sutra and the Heart Sutra in the Prajnaparamita text. One night I was studying both the Sanskrit and Chinese versions of the Large Sutra and the Heart Sutra, and I noticed for the first time that the core sections, and we'll talk a little bit more about what the core section is, of the Heart Sutra was in both sutras. And so there's this core section of the Heart Sutra that comes right out of this is the 25,000 line long version of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. Okay, so it's a 25,000 line Prajnaparamita Sutra, but the middle part, the meat kind of in the middle of the Heart Sutra, is essentially a direct quote from it. But in the Chinese texts, the wording is exactly the same. So in Chinese, there's a version of this very long version of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, and of course, there's Xuanzang's Chinese version of the Heart Sutra, and in there, the core is exactly the same, almost character by character. Whereas in the Sanskrit version, the meaning is the same, but the wording is quite different. And so actually, Jan Nattier is a very meticulous scholar. And so her argumentation, this is kind of the gist of her argumentation, of her argument, but it's actually quite detailed. But she came to the conclusion that the Chinese version of the Heart Sutra was the older one, and that the Sanskrit version was a back translation. I instantly knew that what had happened, that's what had happened. I was totally stunned. I had never imagined anything like this, and I certainly hadn't gone looking for it. Now, what I was pointing out before about the Platform Sutra and the Kanzeon Sutra and the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra and the and Dogen's Mountains and Waters Sutra, shows that sometimes people are a little fast and loose with the use of the label sutra. But up until and people had noticed that there was something different about the Heart Sutra in the past, but Jan Nattier was the first one to really say, well, this is not really a sutra in the sense that it was, taught by the Buddha, written down in Sanskrit, then translated into Chinese. It is something that was the form that we have it in was written in Chinese first. Large parts of it were taken from real sutras, but the form that we have it in is not a original sutra. That's her thesis, and this paper that she wrote wrote it in 1992. People have been talking about it, sometimes arguing about it ever since. Oh yeah, by the way, this is Frederick. This is a quote from an interview with Jan Nattier in Frederick Schott's book, My Heart Sutra, which is, there's a lot of books on the Heart Sutra that I really don't like. Red Pines is kind of, I like Red Pine's book is very useful if you're like kind of digging into the Heart Sutra, and it's also useful because a lot of people refer to it like he has a line numbering. You can refer to his line numbering if people don't, but it's but it's good. I use it. I read it all the time. But this book in particular is a really good book. It's not nearly as technical and scholarly as Red Pines, but Fred Schott's book, My Heart Sutra, is really great, in my opinion. Okay, so what is this from? Oh yeah, so this is an actual quote from Jan Nattier's paper. And the main thing about this right here is just that it explains a little bit more about what she means by the 3 parts of the Heart Sutra. And so that's actually probably a good place to take a 5-minute break. Then we'll come back and we'll start talking about the parts of the Heart Sutra. If anybody has come up with any questions, or if you don't want to hear any more about Jan Nattier's theory of where the Heart Sutra really comes from, please feel free to tell me that. But it is useful in the way that she divided it up into the introduction, the core, and the conclusion, which is what we'll talk about when we come back from a break. Okay, so we'll take 5 minutes right now. Okay. So, one question about this is, what difference does it make? Which, on the one hand, is a legitimate question, but at the same time, you have to be a little bit careful with it. Today is the 4th of July, right? So, today is the 4th of July. So we celebrate, among other things, freedom of speech and freedom of religion, so like in Buddhism, traditionally or historically in Buddhism, it has not been a requirement for everybody to just accept what they're told, without questioning it. That's not really part of Buddhism. So questioning things is good. Question and asking uncomfortable questions, up to and including, well, wait a minute, is this really a sutra, or what does it mean when you say it's a sutra, or and just coming to a better understanding of that is, I think, legitimate. And also, it's depending on how your mind works, it's kind of fun. I mean, especially if you and I really need to look into this. I don't know if anybody here has any better knowledge of Soto Zen than I do, but how did Dogen get away with just saying, oh, here, I just wrote a sutra, the Mountains and Water Sutra, and everybody just accepted, oh yeah, here's in any list of Dogen's writings, there's this one thing that he wrote that he just decided to call a sutra, and that everybody just kind of accepts it. And so what's up with that? And I'm not really sure what's up with that, to tell you the truth. Well, but all right. But before we get into that, let me just get to the more practical part of Jan Natie's contribution to our understanding of the Heart Sutra. And she's written a bunch of other stuff too that's really good. Unfortunately, because of the kind of scholar she is, and she doesn't, I'm not sure why. It's probably because she doesn't really write for a mass audience. Her books tend to be like really expensive. Well, but not, let's see. Actually, there's one that is only like $25. But anyway, but she writes really interesting books. She's written some very interesting things on the history of the development of the idea of the Bodhisattva path in very, very early Mahayana Buddhism. But let me. My intention is to move forward a little bit from this. Oops, not from the beginning, but okay. Now it's from the current slide. Okay, excuse me. All right, I'm gonna fast forward. Okay, now everybody can see this slide, right? Yeah. All right. So this is kind of the breakdown of the Heart Sutra, using Jan Natie's breakdown, about which there really isn't that much or anything that's controversial. And so she focuses on the this part, the intro, Avalokiteshvara. This is using the translation that I think most of us would be familiar with. I think I'm not sure. I don't think Zen Master Sung San himself did this translation, but he oversaw and approved it. Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, when practicing deeply the Prajnaparamita, perceives that all 5 skandhas are empty and is safe from all suffering and distress. Now, the thing that kind of marks this off, 2 things that mark this off from the rest of the Heart Sutra, is that one, this is not a direct quote from the longer 25,000 line Prajnaparamita Sutra. And the other thing that marks it off from the rest of the sutra is that Avalokiteshvara is not speaking here. This is just a description of the scene of the sutra. It's not clear who. It's basically, an omniscient narrator here in this part. Then we get to the core, and from here all the way down to here is the core. And in here, it is Avalokiteshvara who is speaking. All of a sudden, Shariputra is there. It's not clear where Shariputra came from. Usually in a sutra, when someone is being addressed, it's because they've asked a question. There's no question that's been asked. Just Avalokiteshvara just starts explaining stuff to Shariputra, and so it goes all the way down to up to no attainment and nothing to attain. And then this is this again is the conclusion. It is not a direct quote from the 25,000 line Prajnaparamita Sutra. I'm going to have to take John Natier's and others' word for that. I haven't looked it up, but no one has challenged her on that part. But and this is describing the results of practicing the Prajnaparamita. The Bodhisattva depends on Prajnaparamita, and the mind is no hindrance. And then, and leading up to describing the benefits of practicing the Prajnaparamita, which is also a focus of the introduction as well, leads into then describing or praising the mantra, and then into the mantra itself, which is the final part of the Heart Sutra. And one thing that is interesting is that in both the intro and in the conclusion, are more positive. The intro says that the intro introduction does stress that Avalokiteshvara's perception of all five skandhas does stress that Avalokiteshvara had the insight, or perceives that all five skandhas are empty. But then it immediately says that because of that insight, Avalokiteshvara is saved from all suffering and distress. And in the class that just occurred on Saturday on the Heart Sutra, we actually talked about this section of the Heart Sutra in the Chinese. And one thing that's quite interesting about this is that this word "saved" is the same Chinese word that we use that is found in the Four Great Vows. In the first of the Four Great Vows, when we say sentient beings are numberless, we vow to save them all. And so that word shows up a lot in Mahayana literature, and it is, I think, usually, and it's kind of expected. At least it's my expectation, in my understanding and my feel for Mahayana Buddhism, that usually when this business of saving is talked about, that it is bodhisattvas who are saving sentient beings. And so it's either a question of like the Buddhas and the bodhisattvas, or some particular Buddha or some particular bodhisattva who is saving sentient beings, or I'm asking them to save me or to save someone else or whatever. Or in the case of the Bodhisattva vows, where we are taking on ourselves, instead of asking to be saved, we are saying we are, stepping up to try to begin to fulfill that position ourselves as bodhisattvas, taking on that aspiration of bodhisattva to begin the work of saving sentient beings. We are vowing to do that ourselves. But here, what's being described is a great bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, being saved from her or his perception that all five skandhas are empty. Anyway, so, which is a bit odd, but at the same time, it's good that it's there, because, in my opinion, because it's shows a positive benefit because otherwise, okay, so you see everything is empty. Well, now what? What do? Give up? Everything's empty, so nothing matters, right? No. Seeing emptiness saves you from all suffering and distress. And then at the end, it's even better. The mind is no hindrance. Without any hindrance, no fears exist. Far apart from every deluded view. Deluded? Really? Did I put it deluded? We don't usually say perverted. I don't know. Somebody changed this. I didn't change it. Every perverted view. Well, and perverted, deluded, distorted, inverted. Sometimes people will say, one dwells in nirvana, and this is the nirvana that Camille was asking about earlier. Whereas in the Chinese version, this is just as this nirvana here is an attempt to spell out a Sanskrit word using our alphabet. In the Chinese, it's an attempt to spell out a Sanskrit word using Chinese characters, which is really crazy. Anyway, in the three worlds, all Buddhas depend on Prajnaparamita and attain Anuttara Samyak Bodhi. Now, a lot of people, one of the things that people notice about the Heart Sutra is the contradiction between saying no attainment with nothing to attain, and just a few lines later, all Buddhas attain. It's the same in the Chinese, it's exactly the same word. The thing that there is nothing of and nothing to, there's no attainment and nothing to attain. The same word is used down here in a positive sense, that this is what all Buddhas attain. And so this is one place where Jan Natier's insight or theory kind of makes a little bit of a difference. This is added. This is not in, the part of the Heart Sutra that is a direct quote from the 25,000 line Prajnaparamita Sutra, which everyone accepts as a real sutra. And what is a real sutra is another interesting question. But this is a direct quote from it, but this is not. This is added. This is an elaboration. And again, just like the intro, it's more positive. All Buddhas attain Anuttara Samyak Bodhi is more positive than there is no attainment and nothing to attain. If you stop there, yeah, it's not very positive, is it? So that's kind of interesting. Yeah. And then it gets even more positive by going on and on about this wonderful, glorious, beautiful mantra that's coming up. And then the mantra itself, Gate Gate Pada Gate Pada Samgate Bodhisvaha. So that's one of the things that I struggled with in thinking about how we should approach this class and how we should approach the Heart Sutra is how to break it up. And so this is kind of a good way of breaking up the Heart Sutra. And I would invite people to kind of look at this and to kind of help us in our next three classes to look at this. A lot of it is here in the core, but there's actually some very important stuff in the introduction and the conclusion. And then there's actually a lot that can be said about the mantra and the title as well. So I don't know, it's going to be interesting to see what we can come up with in the next three meetings. But does anybody have any? I've got some more stuff to say about Jan Nattier and what is a sutra and why are some things called sutras and how does something get to be called a sutra and what does the word sutra even mean? But I do want to give people a chance to, ask questions or make comments at this point if you have anything to.
Kurt?
Yes.
I just remember.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a quote from Sung San.
Uh-huh.
That he referenced the Heart Sutra as a bunch of words. many words, and
Oh,
that the mantra
uh-huh.
was really the most important
Yes.
aspect of it. Do you know that quote?
No, I don't. So I don't know that quote, but so generally speaking, um, Mahayana Buddhism is like huge. If you look at all, I mean, like the sutras, they go. Traditionally, it's said that there are 84,000 teachings in Mahayana Buddhism. It doesn't mean that there's 84,000 different sutras, but that there are 84,000 specific ideas or teachings that are part of Mahayana Buddhism, and somewhere they're in, and many of those teachings are scattered across lots of different sutras, but the Prajnaparamita sutras in particular are supposed to be kind of the core of Mahayana Buddhism. And then the Heart Sutra is the very, very, very distilled condensation of the Prajnaparamita teachings. And the mantra is the distilled condensation of the Heart Sutra itself. So, and I think that any teacher of Mahayana Buddhism would agree with that. That if you really want to understand the Heart Sutra, recite the mantra a million times, um, and you won't regret it. um,
Right.
it won't
I've
necessarily
often
give you an intellectual understanding, but anyway, go ahead, Joe.
No, I was just going to say I've often looked at it as our like Apostles' Creed. Maybe it's the Bodhisattva's creed for Buddhism.
Well, the only we should put an asterisk next to that, and that is that if you didn't recite the Apostles' Creed, it went badly for you. That was the function of the Apostles' Creed, was to sort out the heretics, and the Heart Sutra doesn't function like that.
True. True.
And also, the Heart Sutra doesn't come to us like that. The Apostles' Creed was cobbled together by a committee who were called by the emperor to lay down the law to,
Yep.
sort out who was a heretic and who wasn't. The Heart Sutra, I mean, yeah, the Heart Sutra is a very different kind of origin.
Or our profession of faith, more or less.
Yeah, and so it definitely is a profession of faith, but it, as I was saying before, it in no way has to be accepted on faith.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be accepted on faith. In fact, one of my favorite stories about the Heart Sutra is Dao Sheng. Dao Sheng, who's like the I think he's essentially the one of the two, but really the main earliest founder of the Soto tradition. When he was a child, his parents hired a tutor to teach him, Chinese characters and the Confucian classics and basic Buddhism. And when the tutor was teaching him the Heart Sutra, this little kid stopped him and said, "Wait a minute, I have eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, so what is this? And why does the Heart Sutra say that I don't?" And the tutor said, "Those questions like that are above my pay grade. If you want to ask questions like that, you have to ask a Zen teacher." And that's right at the beginning of Dao Sheng's biography, and so asking those questions, and a similar question is, who said this is a sutra? What kind of a sutra is it? How come? Where's Ananda? If this is a sutra, where's Ananda? And which is very similar to more intellectual, but the same kind of, the mind of questioning is why all those moves are in the Heart Sutra, is to encourage the mind of not accepting these things, not accepting all these categories. Whether so like in Red Pine's discussion, he's talking about critiquing the categories of Sarvastivadin philosophers or whatever, but Dao Sheng, not Dao Sheng. It's what was his name? Who's what's the name I'm trying to think of? It's not Dung. Oh, now I'm embarrassing myself. Yeah, no, it's not Dao Sheng. It's the guy who the earliest founder of Soto Zen in China. Anyway, he was a compatriot of Matsu, um, but he didn't know anything about Sarvastivadin philosophy. He just said, "Hey, I have eyes. What's this? Why are you saying this anyway?" Okay, so
Can I ask?
good question. Yeah, please.
I'm curious about like the function of Shariputra in the sutra. And I guess I'm really curious on your thoughts. So when I translated it,
Mhm.
the characters that make up his name,
Yeah.
and I could have definitely made a mistake in translating it, but they
Uh-huh.
translate as Sariras. And so
Yes. Uh-huh. Right.
is that because like he was considered the first to leave Sariras? Like, are they named after him, or like is that supposed to be like context that I'm not getting, or is that just like a mistranslation? I was just curious.
Yeah. So I don't know what. So whatever the connection between Sarira's and Shariputra's name would go back to the Sanskrit, and I'm not familiar with that. But
Okay.
the Chinese characters, so the first two characters, Shadi or
Mhm.
Sadi, are just it's another example of transliteration,
Okay.
and then the Ja is put on the end of his name, just like Lao
Yeah.
Tzu. It's the same character as Lao Tzu and Mengzi and Kongzi. All great teachers.
Yeah.
That's the title for a master, for a great teacher. Um, yeah, so that's what's going on with his name.
Okay.
Yeah, as far as I know, but that doesn't it um if you take those two characters, the first two characters in Shariputra's name, that is the Chinese word for Sarira.
Yeah.
And I don't know, and the reason for that is because that Chinese word is yet another transliteration from the Sanskrit. So I don't know what the original um,
Got
relationship between Shariputra's name and the whole thing with Sarira is, if there is a connection. But if there is, it's a Sanskrit connection, I think, not a Chinese connection. I know even less Sanskrit than I know Chinese.
Okay. So it's not necessarily like basically saying like the distillation of the teachings.
Yeah,
I guess that's always how I've
yeah.
interpreted Sarir. So I didn't know if I
Uh-huh.
was missing something or if
And
that was me.
it could be, and I'll tell you what, you could write a book about that and people would believe it, and it could become a thing. It could become a Buddhist thing because it sounds good. uh, any other questions at this point? Let me go back a little bit. There's let's see. Oh yeah, this is just another quote from this book by Stephen Aldous. Stephen Aldous, Stanley Lombardo, and Judith Reutemann, who are all great teachers, good teachers, good writers. Uh, they have an interesting way of putting this. The Heart Sutra is arguably the fundamental text of East Asian Buddhism. I'm not sure what that means, but I mean it is extremely important, and it's probably the most widely chanted practice in East Asian Buddhism. It was enormously influential, chanted. It was long thought to have been a section or an abbreviation of the 600-volume Sanskrit Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. A recent study by John Nattier suggests that the Heart Sutra was actually composed in China, probably in the 7th century, and later back translated into Sanskrit, although the center section was indeed taken from the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. So this is just a recapping, showing how Jan Nattier's ideas are taken very seriously by people. The text may have been originally intended for chanting as a scripture rather than composed as a sutra per se. And so and then it just kind of caught on. People just assumed, well, if we're calling it a sutra, it must be like a sutra. But actually, so since everybody accepts that there is a big chunk of the sutra, of the Heart Sutra as we know it, that is taken from a much longer sutra, it's actually very common to take pieces of very long sutras and carve them out and label them as sutras in their own right. So the Avalokita, if you ever hear people talk about the Avalokiteshvara Sutra or even the Kuan Yin Sutra or the Kwanzaa Bosal Sutra, they're talking about chapter 25 of the Lotus Sutra. That's a very common way of referring to chapter 25 of the Lotus Sutra, which is all about Avalokiteshvara. And so in this case, yeah, it's a real sutra. And it doesn't start with "Thus have I heard," and it doesn't end with a section on how to disseminate it, because it's part of a sutra, but people take it out and treat it as a separate sutra on its own. The Avatamsaka Sutra, which is like really, really long, has several sections that are treated as individual sutras in their own right. And the Maharatnakuta Sutra, which is a real mouthful, is actually a compilation of sutras, and these do begin, I think, with "Thus have I heard" and end with a section on the dissemination. So they fit the model for what a sutra is supposed to be. But these are just further examples of the fact that actually the word sutra is used in more than one way, and there's even more examples of that. Let's see. Oh yeah, I'm going to skip this slide for now. But if you look at, so this is the character for sutra, which is in Mandarin, it's something like Jing. In Japanese, it's Go, right? So when you chant anybody here ever chanted the Heart Sutra in Japanese? Maka Hanya Haramita Shingyo. Maka Hanya Haramita Shingyo is where they usually do it. In Korean Buddhism, it's Mahabanya Bara Milta Shim Gyong. And actually, they even use a slightly different character in Japanese, just because they're, that's the way the Japanese are. They have to be different. But this is the same character. And it's also the same character in the I Ching, the classic of documents. These are, and there's even a name for the I Ching and these other books. They're called the Five Jings, the Five Sutras. These are not Buddhist texts. These are they're not Taoist texts either. There's a whole separate kind of thing on what do Taoists mean by sutra or Jing. Of course, there's the Tao Te Ching, which is a Taoist text, and this is the name of Dogen's Mountains and Water Sutra, written in Chinese characters, including the Japanese form. But this is a standard Chinese character for a mountain. This is a standard Chinese character for water, and this is the Japanese version of the Chinese character for sutra. The mountains, and so sometimes it's called Mountains and Water Sutra, sometimes it's called Mountains and River Sutra. This is a long and interesting definition of the word sutra from Paul W. Kroll's A Student's Dictionary of Classical Medieval Chinese, which is really great. I wouldn't recommend you run out and buy it. It's a little pricey. It's at least 40 or 50 bucks. And you have to be careful. It has a bunch of different editions. And you have to make sure that you want to make sure that you're buying the most recent one. Actually, right now, if you go to Amazon, the one that I have, which is no longer the most recent one, is like really expensive. It's like $100 to buy it. Whereas the one that I believe is the most recent one is like 40 or 50 bucks. Anyway, but these are the definitions of this character, Jing. Its most basic meaning is that in ancient Chinese, it was a word that referred to weaving. And it was the warp threads in weaving. And this is so when you set up your loom, you attach the warp threads to the loom itself, and then you weave. Actually, I think the warp threads go up and down, and then you weave through them. And the warp and the woof, I think, is the other part. But the
weft.
There you go. And those threads hang on and are supported by the warp threads. and the warp threads are supported by the loom itself. And so this is just, so to generalize from this, it is any sort of a basic framework on which to construct something or organize things. It is just as it is in weaving. The warp threads in weaving are what you weave on. And therefore, a little bit more general is any guideline, norm, standard, or guiding principle. And then, as in the case of the I Ching and the classic of documents, the Book of Rites, and the classic of music, this one, in fact, the classic of music is not one of the 5 classics, because this is actually called the 6th classic. It's been lost. It no longer exists, although records of it having existed clearly show that it used to be one of the great Chinese classics. No longer exists. Actually, there was a time, there was an emperor in China who went crazy and decided to burn all the classics, which is an interesting story. And I think that's where the classic of music was lost. Anyway, so any classic, a canonical foundational text recognized as, so it goes on and on and on. Turns out these texts were the ones that you had to study to take the infamous or famous civil service exams, which was the way for people to, for anybody in China, regardless of your class background, if your parents could afford to put you to school and you could learn these classics, you could take the exam and could get a government job. Which is a really interesting part of Chinese culture, but it's also one of the things that drives Chinese kids to this day crazy, because that idea is still in place where, a lot of pressure is placed on children to do well on these exams, and to improve the status of their family. Anyway, but of course, in Buddhism, so Paul Kroll often has separate entries in his definitions for terms that are meaningful specifically in Buddhism. The scriptures supposedly spoken by the Buddha, all of which begin with, "Thus have I heard." So it's right there in black and white in Paul Kroll's dictionary. If it doesn't say, "Thus have I heard," it's not a sutra. The definition for Taoist sutras is very interesting. Scriptures, sacred and pre-cosmic texts issuing from the void and formed from the primordial chi, transcribed into celestial script by the divinities and eventually revealed in vulgar human script to select human beings. That's a dictionary definition right there, right? Okay, so also anything to align, regularize, arrange, organize. Meridians, north, south, orientation for also the basic circulatory channels or conduits of qi through which qi travels in our bodies are also sutras. And one thing that Paul Kroll doesn't mention is that when we say, when people do walking meditation, they refer to it as kinhin. It's actually sutra practice. Is the kin in kinhin is a different Japanese pronunciation of the same character, and so one of the meanings of this character that kind of refers back to this basic anything that organizes things. It's used in the military to refer to drills and in particular to marching. So when you say kinhin, it's marching practice is what kinhin actually means in Japanese. Or you could say that it means sutra practice, which is also what it means in Japanese. Anyway, so we have just enough time to recite the Heart Sutra together one last time to end our class. But at the same time, I'm not necessarily going anywhere. So if anybody has any questions or anything you want to bring up at the end, that would be fine. I don't know if anybody else is going to run out to go watch fireworks or something on the 4th of July. No? Okay. Then I will, let's see, what do we got here? Am I still sharing my screen? No, I'm not. So I better find the, oh good, I still have it here. Do I? Yeah. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thanks, Kurt.
It's been
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.